Oftentimes the only woman, didn't have time to think about being Asian. It was just dealing with the gender dynamics in sports. I now do career coaching, executive coaching, and I do a lot of speaking on diversity, equity, inclusion issues in corporate America. And the reason I think I'm on this panel today is because I started an initiative called Agency DEI, and we are tracking corporate workforce data. Starting with the advertising industry, but basically tracking year over year, what do workforces at various companies actually look like? Looking at progression, looking at seniority, looking at departments, actually looking at what this, tracking this data over time, that it's a long-term initiative. That if we think about who actually has power in this country, right, outside of our government, it's also who leads corporations. And so this effort is to try and track what companies are actually doing and create some accountability in a centralized and standardized way so that people, the employees, the talent, have a resource to actually start to hold their companies accountable to the things that they say they're going to do, instead of all the pledges and all the dollars that are being committed. And then in addition, the activism work that I do in the round in Manhattan, in Chinatown, is tied to Neighbors United Below Canal, which a lot of you might know the mega jail that's filling up in Chinatown. Neighbors United Below Canal has been the main group that's been trying to fight that for the last 3+ years. So I think that's why I'm here today, but great to be with you all.
Before the film started, Christine actually mentioned how this is such a complex film. I think there's a number of rich topics that were hinted at or be covered. I'm actually curious for each of you, what sort of stood out for you, or what was the main takeaway when you were watching the film as you sort of saw it?
Gosh, there's so much in it. I think it reminded me what I think lots of mainstream non-lawyer Americans often forget or don't want to know, and that's how long the process takes for cases to make their way through our court system. And what was unique, of course, about this particular killing was that it made its way through the state system, and then after that made its way twice through the federal system. And part of me sitting here thinking, wow, 5 years actually wasn't that long. But so I think that the patience and the persistence that advocacy requires was one big thing that kind of stood out for me. And of course, I think the mother's words at the end, to all good and honest people, still in my ears right now. Those two things.
It's been a while since I saw this documentary, and so it's a pleasure to view it again. And it's informative to see it through the lens of having worked on 2 anti-Asian violence reports. The thing that strikes out for me, strikes a chord with me, is the saying, the more things change, the more they remain the same. I mean, 40 years ago, when Vincent was killed, there was not much hate crime legislation to be heard of. It wasn't a hate crime statute that the Michigan attorneys could have prosecuted under. And in a way, because of Vincent Chin's case, more and more states, including New York, adopted hate crimes legislation. So there's, if this happened today, would Vincent Chin have obtained justice through the court system, through a hate crime statute? I think our report will tell you no, and that's unfortunate. And the one thing that really struck me was when they interviewed I think it was the prosecutor. One thing he said really struck me. When he called Helen Zia naive, for thinking that they had all these resources to deal with all the cases that are coming in, and that they can't even go after the quote-unquote serious crimes. As if killing a man with a baseball bat is not a serious crime. And that, unfortunately, I think Elaine could back you up on this. Part of what we did in the report was talk to a lot of victims, talk to a lot of prosecutors. And unfortunately, a lot of themes, keep coming up. For example, the initial defense from Ebens was, Vincent started it. And unfortunately, to this day, when we talk to prosecutors, it almost seems like even with hate crime statutes in place, the first reaction from prosecutors is, how do we not prosecute this case? How do we not find hate crime? Which is really disturbing. And typically it's because, well, the victim started. And we heard that tonight. And I'm, sitting here 40 years later and thinking, the more things change, the more they remain the same.
I mean, I was fucking furious like watching this. It's infuriating watching this movie. But I think on a few levels, there's, for lack of a better word, the idiocy, the ignorance, the sheer and I'm dumbfounded listening to Ebens talk, his wife speak about 6 people went out, 1 person died, and no one knows what happened, right? Or even the judge talking about if it had been a brutal murder, of course he'd be in jail, right? These kinds of statements, which to me are kind of that insidious layer that sits below the surface of very obvious racism. I think the argument can be made that this is where it started, right? There was a racial element that started the entire conversation at the strip club. But the complications that then, or not the complications, but the nuances and the details and complexity that then kind of inform the entire situation, pull people away from kind of the core conversation, which reminds me what Jan was just talking about, is the conversation around whether it really was a hate crime and how that pattern is repeating itself today. So there's that element, the idiocy, the ignorance, the sheer kind of the blind perspective that some people have sitting on one side of the table. And I think the other part of it too, in the macro scale, is how so many of these patterns are repeating as far as anti-China rhetoric. There are states that have passed legislation that are barring supposed members of the Chinese Communist Party from buying land, right? But there's no determination, there's no clear distinction of how you're going to qualify whether someone is a member of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's happening in Arizona, that's happening in Texas. So those kinds of things are no different to me than kind of the anti-Japan rhetoric of post-World War II, post-Japan's kind of economic auto manufacturing rise. And so those kinds of themes are constantly, I think, part of the Asian experience, because when something bad is happening to this country, whether it's the economy, whether it's a war, whether it's a pandemic, there's constantly that scapegoating theme that happens. And it's really heartbreaking to see that that part hasn't changed at all.
Really great points, and I think you also brought a really great point. And I think before we dive any deeper, we'd love your insight into what constitutes hate crime. Where is that bar? And I think we've seen a lot of assaults happening in New York City and also across the country. And I think we all jump to say that this is clearly a hate crime, but I guess from a legal perspective, what is that?
I think I'll defer to the law professor this one. So Wayne, why don't you tell us what a hate crime is?
So I don't see any of my first year law students in the rear of my plane, but the final exam was on the hate crime fact pattern. Of course it was. So first, can I actually start with the phrase hate crime? I actually think that, as Young said, the whole idea of hate crimes being like a certain type of crime is a fairly modern concept. In fact, Vincent Chin, in his case, the federal prosecutors were able to bring federal hate crime laws because the feds have had statutes since, I think it was the late 1960s. In New York, we, like many other states, were perhaps inspired, yes, by the Vincent Chin killing, but also probably by many, many other incidents, I'm sure, and killings. We actually didn't pass our hate crime statutes in New York until the year 2000. So I never got to practice at a time as a state prosecutor, because that was after I left the office. But so hate crime, though, as a phrase, I think in some way is very misleading, because hate is a 4-letter word, and it's perhaps one of the most appealing and emotionally kind of dramatic 4-letter words, right? And so for a lot of folks, I find that the name sometimes ends up hurting our advocacy or our cause, because it makes us very narrowly, and our prosecutors perhaps very narrowly, think of hate crimes is only those crimes that are really motivated by hate. I'm not a racist. I have Chinese customers, so my kid helped this Japanese kid in class. Like right here, it's like I don't hate anybody, right? And so I'll just say that first. Is sometimes I think about it's probably too late, but whether in our laws and in our mainstream we could replace that phrase. But to answer your question, in New York State, in the report, we talk a lot about the New York statute because this is a very New York centric report for many reasons. But in New York State, a hate crime is one of a lot of like existing crimes. So a homicide, a sexual assault, right? All different types of crimes. If you commit one of those regular crimes, and then if the reason why you committed the crime has something to do with the belief or perception that you have about another person's race, national origin, gender, ability, religion, age, the list is quite long, and nicely so in New York. If that's the reason why you actually decided to commit the crime, it's not much like a hate, then that's a hate crime. It also is the case that, let's say you've already decided to commit a crime. You woke up today, you said, today I'm going to commit a robbery. But if the reason why you selected a victim had to do with the belief or perception that you had, again, about that person's sexual orientation, about, again, their ethnicity. So for instance, that an Asian victim will be less likely to report a robbery to the police. If that's why you selected your victim, that too is a hate crime. And the final thing I'll say, and the report talks a lot about this, is that in New York State, that belief or perception that you have about another person's race, again, it doesn't have to be rooted in hate, but it has to be in whole, and this is what the statute says, in whole or in substantial part, the reason for doing the crime at all, or the reason for picking that victim to do your crime of the day. In whole or in substantial part. This is part of what Young was describing. When prosecutors see that standard, when they read all those words, they're like, ooh, we better have like the strongest, tightest case of evidence, right? Because we gotta meet that very high standard.
So I'm gonna complicate this a little bit. So before the hate crime statute passed in 2000 in New York, there was already existing something called aggravated harassment in the second degree. And that's caused some confusion. And I've only became aware of this through writing these reports. But a couple of years ago when a lot of this happened and Stop API Hate was collecting a lot of information about the attacks, a lot of the attacks that were being reported were like shoving, spitting, things of that nature, accompanied by a slur or other, racial epithet or evidence of racial animus. And I kept asking the prosecutors in our, in our membership, is that a hate crime? Can that be charged? And the answer was yes. And the fact that a lot of people were experiencing, a lot of Asians were experiencing those kind of assaults, they could have actually charged hate crimes. So one of the things that we propose in the report is file aggravated harassment under the hate crime statute. Right now, it's in like a different section of the law. Some police officers don't know that it exists, which is part of the problem of actually, getting convictions and charges. So, we're advocating for that change in the law. Also advocating for getting more substantial out of the hate crimes definition because we think it might create too high a burden for the prosecutors. A lot of other states have just done it as in whole and part. And we think New York should follow that.
And then for each of you, I mean, you already talked, we talked about hate crime laws. From this movie compared to today, what do you feel like are things that have stayed the same as the original? What do you feel like are things that have changed or improved?
I think there are some differences and there are some similarities. Like I want to, I guess, point out some of the differences. We talked a little bit about how things just stay the same. Again, thinking about some of my law students, thinking about some of the young people in my life, as in my family and my friends network, I want to say that particularly in the wake of the death of George Floyd, right, the movement of the abolition movement, let's abolish the criminal legal system, the cries to defund the police, right, they're coming from really what is a very powerful, driven particularly by younger generations, which demand to be heard, right? This real rejection of our criminal legal system wholesale. And I think what is really different is that Vincent Chin didn't quite happen in a moment like that. And so one of the things for any of us who've been thinking about hate crimes and how we're seeing the advocacy unfold across the country as we're watching the recall, right, of the district attorney in San Francisco, for instance, is that what hate crimes are this incredibly hopeful ambition to imagine and take back a criminal legal system that we all frankly deserve to have. And to remember that, you know, what we want is a criminal legal system, yes, that is not a racist system in terms of how it decides who to prosecute, but it also should be just and equal when folks and communities are victimized and harmed by crime. And that is really what anti-Asian, I think, hate crimes and this crisis right now is forcing us to confront, alongside our tremendous dissatisfaction with incarceration and with, you know, very monolithic kind of approaches to crime, and yes, over prosecution of many Black and brown communities. But so in the midst of that, you know, Asians are kind of like, wait a second, there's a lot of harm happening here, from spitting to shoving. But really, some of the incidents we looked at in 2021 in New York City were very serious incidents. So me and my research team, many of whom were students, it was traumatic. I feel like Young needs to hire some mental health counseling for us, because we would go back and over reread our sources about, right, people who were robbed, people who were hit with metal pipes, hit with hammers, people who were, right, shoved down a flight of stairs on the subway, pushed onto subway tracks. Like, you know, it was the spitting and the shoving, but also lots of violent things as well, and simply for being Asian. So the second difference I'll say, and I'll just end here, is the pandemic, right? The pandemic has been such a consuming, overwhelming global kind of crisis for all of us that I think what was so frightening about this moment is that many of these acts of violence that have occurred to Asian New Yorkers have occurred really without any prior interaction between perpetrator and victim. So, right, everything that happened here with Vincent Chin, there was like, you know, significant amount of time and interactions. We heard about them at the strip club, you know, hostile words were exchanged. What was so frightening to grandma and to our cousins and to ourselves was that in our city, you could simply be, right, walking while Asian, breathing while Asian, shopping while Asian, like just being Asian out in the public street. And this is what was happening in the attack. So I'll say that those two things, the pandemic feels really different from like the auto crisis. It just feels much more frightening.
And I think from another perspective of change and what's happening, you know, Pam, I'm curious. We obviously are seeing these attacks now, and I think people are sort of trying to figure out, well, what could be different, or what can we do? And I know you've been at the front lines and you're working DEI. You know, how do we sort of go about potentially changing some of the ignorance or the prejudice or racism that exists today?
Easy question. So I just want to build off of what Elaine was saying, just one last thing, because what you were talking about in terms of that truly kind of unprecedented lack of contact kind of attack harkens back to like a century ago, right? When communities across Western the US were ethnically cleansing communities of Chinese people, right? Like, so that reminds me actually of a very long time ago in American history when the largest lynching, for example, in the US was in, I think was it LA's Chinatown, or was it in California Chinatown? And so those kinds of things, unprovoked, completely without having cause, right? That's the kind of stuff that we're seeing the legacy of. But on a hopeful note, on things that have changed. So I guess one thing that I'll note that I guess ebbs and flows, less that it's kind of wholesale changed over time, is there has been Asian activism throughout our history, right? Birthright citizenship was established by a Chinese man, right? These things that everybody benefits from in this country now, right? So those things have been happening throughout American history, but I don't think it's happened consistently, right? It's oftentimes happened where there is an event, there's a circumstance, there's a uprising, there's a murder, an unjust murder, there's someone who's being denied citizenship. Those kinds of things will kind of galvanize the community, and the history of Asian Americans kind of coming together in this country is also complicated because so many of our parents and their kind of histories with other Asian ethnicities are not cohesive. They're not friendly. I grew up kind of being told like very kind of racially kind of racist things about other Asian ethnicities, right? So there's that complication too. What I'm hopeful about over time, and I think what's happened in the last 2 years, and I'm hoping will stay true kind of going forward, not just when there's an incident or when there's some massive, event for us to come together, is that there will be consistent pressure over time. Because there is the Yuri Kochiyamas of the world, right? There was the Maple Leaves who was a women's suffrage, who was in the women's suffrage movement. Like those people have been in our history, but it hasn't been consistent where there's kind of this spike and then things kind of trail off in like peacetime where things are fine and people are focused on their lives. And so my hope is the last 2 years, it's brought more of us together, maybe first generation, second generation who've been in the US longer, who are now kind of seeing other Asians as kind of allies and friends and comrades rather than, enemies to a degree, because that's how some of our parents grew up, right? Seeing other Asians as enemies. And so that I'm really hopeful for. And then secondly, what I'm hopeful for is people trying to figure out, because oftentimes after these events, we're like, what can we do, right? What petition, what donation, what protest? There might be something for that event or that moment, but I think what I'd like to ask all of you is to think about, what are you interested in, right? What skills do you have? Because there are issues across healthcare, abortion, that directly affect Asian people or communities, whether it's the legal system, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's corporate advocacy, whether it's just overall kind of messaging communications. I'm gonna use this example. So my dear friend Kimberly Byrne, who's sitting right there, she makes these incredible shirts, right? And shows kind of unity across various Asian ethnicities. Her website is, Together We Are Stronger. And so she is an elementary school teacher who in her own free time has designed these shirts and is selling them, but not trying to build a business. She's giving a ton away and trying to build unity across communities, right? Like that's an example of one person who just saw one way that they can contribute using skills that they have, something they can be passionate about, in the same way that I started Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Initiative to try and track data. And like, I see an opportunity, that's something I can be passionate about, and I have a skill set that supports that. So every single one of you in this room is a problem solver, right? You have skills that you can tie to some kind of problem solving. And so my ask to you is to think about, how do those skills also tie to your personal interests, where you think you can help move the needle, and be creative about how that can come together in a way that's a sustainable and actionable solution over time. And I think too often we're waiting for people to tell us like, you can do this, there's this action. And I'm asking everyone to be more proactive and think about creative ways that you can strategically problem solve using your skill set, using your interests, and using what will kind of propel you forward, and thinking about what will actually solve some of these issues in our communities. Because it will be a collective effort, right? It won't be any single one of us. So that makes me hopeful.
Thank you. And I have more questions, but in the interest of time, because I do think the space will be closing soon, we're going to open up for any questions from the audience. Anything that's top of mind, happy to give the mic as well, if that's easier. Any questions?
Or reactions? Thank you so much for sharing, your expertise and how you got into this space. Because as an Asian American woman, I have to admit, what I heard from a few people is that we've been in competition with each other. I mean, my mom be like, focus on being friends with other people in class who are not Asian. And I never understood that, but it just sat in and it was the norm for me, to the point where I want to share. It wasn't until the pandemic that I was even aware that there were Asian people in my apartment complex in my neighborhood. So that being said, my question is actually for Franklin. The Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival, is that something that has already begun? Because I know there's one in New York. And how can people get involved in that?
Oh yeah, so it's been around for, I think, I founded maybe 12 or 14 years ago after college. So there's a number of Asian American film festivals out there today. San Diego's got a great one, LA, and I think a lot of other cities have started their other film festivals. All of them are usually volunteer organizations. So just go to their website, you can easily participate in what they're trying to do. They need people to help select films. I think Christine sort of mentioned it, when you're in film festival, you watch a lot of movies, a lot of films, and some are pretty bad, but some are really good. You need people to screen those movies, but you also need people to usher, help volunteer, fundraise. So there's a lot of opportunities to help out there from the film festival perspective.
Thank you.
Hi, I actually wanted to, considering the panel that we have here, I think what's interesting about even looking at the mega jail and then also just decarceration, like all these things are actually really tied together, along with hate crime. So with bail reform too, there's a degree to which, like, if people were arrested for these things, they would also be released, right? So there's a certain overreaction to say, hey, we should keep these people in jail, but then there's also like, well, we don't want, there's a lot about like progressive, what does criminal justice reform look like, and then also looking at building, mega jail in Chinatown and how it affects the communities. So how do you think about navigating these complex issues where they really are tied together? And then in addition to that, I think a lot of how the city looks at how to solve these things, it has a lot to do with the way data is captured. What do we do in this space? Because it just feels like a big ball of lots of things tied together that are really interconnected.
I'll take the first part. Yeah. In our report, we don't propose any sort of one size fits all solution. It's not just about punishment and putting people in jail. I think when we talk about changing the hate crime statute, it really, the ultimate goal is not punishing people, putting people in jail. The ultimate goal is justice and accountability. There are people, Asian people, who have been injured or killed. And we're trying to get justice and accountability for them. Elaine counted the numbers. We put it in the report. For the first 9 months of 2021, from news reports and from NYPD hate crime database and other sources, we counted 233 hate crimes incidents. Out of that, 91 led to arrest, 41 were charged with hate crimes, 7 led to a conviction. I think any way you slice it, any way you look at the numbers, I can't say there's been justice and accountability based on those numbers. And now, having said that, what does accountability look like? It may not be jail. We do support and put credence in restorative justice and non-carceral solutions. We looked at it, right? So if someone were convicted and we wanted to put that convicted person into a non-carceral like anger management kind of program that's focused on anti-Asian bias, such a program doesn't exist. Right, so, and such programs do exist for, say, anti-Semitic attacks. You know, like a convicted person would have to go and visit the Holocaust Museum and, you know, to write a report about it and so forth. There's nothing similar like that for Asian Americans. So one of the things that we want to do as ABI is to then, let's put something together, right? Because we're not saying we lock people up. You know, there are other ways for them to understand the wrongness of their actions and to make recompense, other than serving time in jail. But a judge won't be able to sentence that person to that program today.
I will just comment on the second question, because that is like the work that you're doing at agency DEI, right? If you don't count it, if you don't measure it, it doesn't get done. So one of the things that was really challenging about trying to compile this data was that I was someone who, and I encourage all of you, if you're searching, you can't figure out your skill inventory, problem solving, you know, idea, I would encourage all of you to, as consumers of news and as advocates, to pay attention when incidents happen, but to follow those cases to the end. To follow those cases to the end. All of us deserve to have working, right, legal systems, governments that work on our behalf. And so that's what we were trying to do. We were told since the onset of the pandemic, report your crimes, report what happens to you, tell us more about it. You guys don't report enough. It's actually your fault, right, that all this stuff is happening. Who's tired of hearing that? So our wonderful, you know, colleagues at Stop AAPI Hate made this wonderful, easy to use app and portal. Yay, you know, lots of things were reported, such an assortment of things, like workplace things to denial of service at the local Starbucks, where there's lots of things in there. And so we were reporting, and I don't know when you reported yours what your hope was, but I think some of us understood that there was this message that things will change, things will get better. But things did not get better in 2021, and I don't think things are much better at all in 2022. So I said to the task force, let's see what happened. Were arrests made? And if arrests were made, did the prosecutors, the lawyers decide to also bring hate crime charges? And so we tried to follow these to the end, but boy, was it hard. Boy, was it hard. So if you ever have tried to follow a criminal case in New York State from beginning to end, the system is built to basically make it extremely difficult. There's like one or two publicly accessible databases that are inaccurate, incomplete, things disappear, they come back, you're like, what is going on? There is no FAQs or like user manual. And this is a whole bunch of trained attorneys like trying to figure this stuff out. So part of the problem is that the government does not want accountability, right, for its criminal legal system, for any of us, those who are over incarcerated and those who in this moment are over victimized. So, but I would encourage us to, and we do in the report, call for more rigorous reporting, more mandatory reporting. Local police precincts do not have to report their hate crime stats to the FBI. They do not have to. And we heard time and again, we worked with some prosecutors outside of New York City proper. I don't know how many of you are from Long Island or Nassau County. Lots of Asian people live in Nassau County, and it prides itself on being a county that is friendly and safe, right, for Asian New Yorkers. But so there's this really tense politic also around sharing of data, and so it's a lot of work has to still get done. But I would encourage all of you to try and to follow with us cases to the end. We're going to try in our next year to do a better job of sharing what we know with the community, because we now are, you know, better at these databases that are terrible, but also having meetings with hate crime chiefs at the local DA's offices. We hope we can continue to have those meetings after this report. I'm hopeful that we will. And so we're gonna, I think, do a better job of passing along information. Hope to see some of you out there on social media, on the streets, in the courthouses with us.
Just realized it's like last question. So you want to, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I was just gonna say, unfortunately, we're sort of out of time, but we're gonna do one last question, and then I'll
1 minute
wrap it
response.
Thank you all for being here. I'm a K-12 educator as well. I work at predominantly independent schools in a predominantly white position. We have students of color, right? This year, one of our seniors made a film about what the experience of being Black at a predominantly white independent school feels like. But I want to see more Asian students stand up. We have student of color affinity groups, which I help facilitate, but I just don't see my Asian students and my Asian children coming to these. So what role do you think education has in fostering change and this, really popular word called feeling of belonging, right? How do these kids truly feel that, like they belong in a society where there isn't accountability all the time, right? And they see all these injustices. How do they, where do they belong?
So I'm gonna,
What's the 1 minute answer to that?
well, my 1 minute answer is extravagance. I think education is huge. I think especially education about Asian American history is huge. And so Albany for the last 14 years now, with the help of the Honorable Rededication Chin from the United States Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and his wife Kathy, we've done each year a reenactment of a significant case involving Asian Americans. Vincent Chin is, I think, number 3 and our most popular. And it's a 1-hour script. We encourage everyone to pick up the script and perform it, not just law students. In fact, on the way here, I saw that the New Yorker had an article about Vincent Chin, and I read it, and they actually mentioned the fact that law students also reenacted Vincent Chin, and I'm like, it's not just Vincent Chin, it's not just law students, it should be everybody. And the Vincent Chin script actually has been picked up by community groups and so forth. So I would encourage your kids, your students, to get our scripts. And we have not just Vincent Chin, we have Fred Korematsu, we have the Massey cases involving Filipino youth who were accused of rape. We just did actually a sort of an anthology called Kung Flu, which traces the history of anti-Asian violence going back to the lynchings in California to present day, ending with Mr. Chin and the Peace Fisherman. So, and another thing that came out of our anti-Asian violence work is that we last fall wrote letters to the deans of the local law school to say you should be offering a course on Asian Americans in the law, because Wong Kim Park is not the only case that Asian Americans put out there to improve the civil rights of everyone. So it's huge. We have to educate K through 12, law school, everyone, but do the reenactments.
Okay, I think when you asked that question, it made me think of a bunch of clients I have that are Asian, 20s to 30s and 40s and up, still struggling with using their voice, right, and learning how to kind of say what they think when they think it, because we grew up, especially if you grew up in an immigrant environment, you grew up in it's such a collectivist mindset, right, it's not an individualist mindset, and so you're constantly sacrificing your opinions, your wants, your needs for quote unquote the greater good, oftentimes your family or your parents. And so I really encourage you to model the behavior and find ways, whether it's through scripts, like what Jan was just talking about, or even in your own actions, or bringing in people who model that behavior. Because in order for kids to speak up, whether it's about anti-Asian hate, whether it's about just their opinions on whatever topic is being discussed in class, there's a foundational skill set that's required. There's that safety that's required to be like, I can say what I think and not be punished. Because I grew up in an environment where I would say what I think and I'd be punished, right? And so over time, you stop doing it. And it wasn't until I had a boss who, I think I was 25 at the time, I was in a client meeting, and he asked me my opinion, and I was like, I think it's great. And he told me aside after that meeting, was just like, next time if I ask you what you think and all you have to say is it's great, I'm not gonna let you come to the next client meeting. And I was like, whoa, people want to know what I have to think, right, or what I have to say, right? And that takes someone encouraging you, kind of creating a space to do so, then modeling the behaviors. Because I think what we're talking about is the content at first, but there's kind of that underlying skill set that I think we haven't had the practice to do. We haven't had the practice at home, but we have to find alternative spaces to do so, whether it's in school, whether it's with a teacher like you, whether it's in our workplaces. And the leg up that other communities have of doing that when they're kids is a huge disadvantage for a lot of, I think, Asian Americans. And so you don't start doing that until you get to college or you get into your first job, right? So if there are ways you can find to demonstrate that behavior, I think that would be foundational, because that's what I do with my clients now, is finding ways for them to practice those behaviors so that when the time comes and they need to speak up, they have the confidence to do so.
I'll just add really quickly, I love working with students, and I'm not K to 12 because I don't want to deal with parents. I'm a big believer, I've learned so much from my students. I've learned so much from young people. I'm a big believer in like asking the students why it is, and I'm sure you've tried, and maybe it's an assortment of answers, but you know, with this pandemic, it wasn't, for all of us, even as adults, we understood how as Asian Americans, we had it very, very hard because we were not just dealing with the pandemic like everyone else, we were dealing with it when it was also very much so a threat to our physical safety, and just emotionally to feel like we were being blamed in some scapegoated crazy way for it. And so imagine you're 15, right? And you're also now doing, you know, school on Zoom. So, but the one thing I would guess at or suggest, if I could channel my 15-year-old self or think about my students, is that I think in a school setting, especially as you know, the prototypical Asian student in the school setting, school isn't necessarily safe. You know, it's just, it's like where I need to get those grades, where I need to stand out to my college admission committees by not being too Asian, but you know, and all that stuff's going on. So I kind of feel like maybe what we need to do is to create spaces like with this organization for young people that they can engage in easy to access ways, but in ways where it's really like they're going outside of the school. And that might be a way we create some safety, but it's hard. Final thing I'll say is voter drives, voter drives, voter drives. Like that is a very real need across all age groups in our community. We should start in our high schools.
Thank you. So we are out of time. I'm going to ask one last question to each of you, which is, you know, because we're out of time, I do think we want to continue the conversation. Sometimes we want to keep talking. So for the audience, if they do want to continue the conversation or reach out for help, what's the best way to get in contact with all of you?
So my website is pamyang.nyc. So that'll be the easiest way.
For me, email youngchen@abby.org, so that's yang.chn@aabany.org. Or just to pick up a copy of the report, I think my name is.
I'm gonna say email as well. You can find me at the St. John's University Law School website. I will also say I've been paying attention more to LinkedIn. I'm so old, and as a former prosecutor, I steer clear of everything Facebook, Twitter, but I realize now it's just such an important and critical way to connect with people on issues of advocacy. So I've been on LinkedIn a lot lately, so you can find me there too. Thanks.
Thank you all for joining this Q&A, but also thank you everyone for coming to watch the film, participate, ask questions. We appreciate you for being here. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vincent Chin 40 commemoration stream hosted by Stand with Asian Americans, The Wing, the Asian American Foundation, and many other community partners. We have on-site events taking place today in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. New York, Chicago, and San Francisco are featuring a screening of the Academy Award-nominated documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin, produced and directed by Christine Choi and Renee Tajima Pena, followed by impactful speaker panels and on-site receptions. Los Angeles is holding a candlelight vigil, performances, and speakers. Today, we had only planned to stream the panel discussions from New York, which, by the way, was incredible, and Chicago, although we ran into a technical issue in Chicago. So this now marks the close of our stream. We will capture the Chicago recording, resolve the technical issue, then we'll upload it to our YouTube channel here at a later time. Now, these events would not be possible without the Asian Justice Movement Coalition, the Vincent and Lily Chin Estate, the Vincent Chin 40th Remembrance and Rededication Team, Helen Zia, Audrey Yamamoto, Jen and Jules from The Wing, and many others. And now I will acknowledge the additional supporting organizations who each contributed to today's events. We have Asian Leaders Alliance, Asian American Bar Association of New York, Asian American Bar Association of Chicago, the National Asian Pacific American Law Students Association, Chicago Asian Women Empowerment, Miss Chinese Chicago, People Matter, Chinese American History Museum of Chicago, Project Vision, Stand with Asians, and Global Leadership Organization. And a big thanks to my co-producers, Jimmy Hua and also Chris Lin. So please visit the vincentchin.org website to replay last week's Vincent Chin Legacy Commemoration events. And also download the Vincent Chin Legacy Guide created by the great Helen Zia and the Vincent and Lily Chin Estate. Please also visit the AsianJusticeMovement.org to register for future events and be a part of the movement. We need you now more than ever to fight for justice, for our rights, to combat anti-Asian hate and hate of all forms across all communities. Please also consider joining the largest ever Asian American-led Unity March in Washington, D.C. this Saturday, hosted by APIA Vote, Gold House, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, along with a coalition of over 50 community orgs. Learn more and register on unitymarch.com. Okay, so let's all remember and honor Vincent Chin, keep telling his story and the injustices he, his family, and our entire community faced. We must keep fighting to make sure his death was not in vain, and that we honor the life he lost, along with many other lives lost to ethnicity-based hate and xenophobia. And we do this by continuing to live our lives in full and continue fighting to keep our community safe and ensure our next generation grows up in a more just world. Have a good night, everyone.